just why have the media and the health establishment been so quiet on this?
Dan, it's puzzling to me. I think the parallel with a nuclear explosion that wipes out 20 million people, wipes out the city of New York, for example. Would we really say we don't know how it started? We'll probably never know. Let's not bother to look because it might cause division and difference. But that's effectively what we're doing. We're talking somewhere between 10 and 20 million people dead as a result of the introduction of a virus into the human species, that the more we look into it, we can't find a natural explanation for it. With every other pandemic of this kind, we very quickly find out how it happened naturally. And this happened in a city, the only city in the world, which has a lab right in the middle of the city working on exactly these kinds of viruses on a massive scale. And all the circumstantial evidence suggests that this is a hypothesis well worthy of investigation. Yeah. And my co-author and I, we looked into it in enormous depth. We went down a lot of blind alleys and trails until we could find out what we could from Chinese websites and so on. And it's, the World Health Organization agrees with us here. It's a serious possibility that it came out of that laboratory. And yet the BBC never covers this story. CNN won't touch it. They booked us and then they disinvited us. It's very odd. I really don't fully understand why it's not a bigger story.
And Matt, I mean, that is a disgrace, the way that some of those major media organisations reacted to your book, because your book is the opposite of hysterical. It is incredibly well researched. You're not jumping to any conclusions. You're simply putting the facts out there. And the BBC and CNN should be covering this issue. Do you think this comes down to the old issue of racism and the idea that it is somehow viewed as being anti-Chinese?
Well, the Chinese official spokesmen have been very busy putting it out there that anyone who talks about the origin of this virus as having come out of the laboratory in Wuhan is being a xenophobic racist. And people are so allergic to being called that they've backed off the story. That is part of it. But I think it's more that there's a lot of people with a vested interest in it not coming out, in it not being investigated. Most journalists don't really want to look into this because they can't get into China, they can't find out about it, and they are genuinely slightly intimidated by the power of the Chinese state, whether directly or indirectly. The same is true of scientists. Most scientists are now depending on directly or indirectly on Chinese funding. They're a bit wary about tweaking the tail of the dragon. And environmentalists are very influential in this debate, and environmentalists want this to be a cautionary tale about the destruction of rainforest and the encroachment on the habitat of bats as being the cause of this. Whereas that story collapses if it turns out that it was the search for viruses that might cause pandemics that caused a pandemic. So it's a very inconvenient story for most people, and there's almost nobody for whom it's a convenient story, which is why someone like me, I'm 64 years old, I'm freelance, I don't have to worry about, I don't work for any institution, I can pursue it. But if I was, a mainstream journalist, a mainstream scientist, I'd be looking over my shoulder to worry about what this would do to my career looking into this story. And as you say, we're not the extremists here. We're not the ones saying it definitely came out of the lab, and we're not speculating. What we do is we present the evidence and say to the reader, here it is, make up your own mind.
Although, by the way, when you look at the evidence, I mean, I'm going to be honest, I'm convinced it came out of the lab. Just one other point I wanted to touch on, Matt, finally, was this idea that you talk about, the science establishment and especially scientific journalists, and you say they tend to be cheerleaders for the sorts of research that's done rather than actually critically analysing the work of these scientists. And I think that's a real downfall in the whole system that we have.
Yeah, and I am one. I mean, that's what most of my career was. I was science editor of The Economist when I was 25, and most of my career has been writing about science. And yes, it's tremendous fun writing about the good news stories that come out of scientific labs, and you don't call up Professor X, who's never been in the media, and try and trash his reputation off the bat. You're calling him up because he's discovered something interesting. And so that's what you do most of the time. You're very different in that sense from a political journalist who spends their whole time trying to trip up to make life difficult for the people they interview. Same is true of business journalists. They don't give businessmen an easy ride always. That's not their job. But in a story like this, where scientists in China have been very, very unclear about what exactly they were up to put it at its most polite, it requires journalists to say, hang on a minute, the answers you gave us 6 months ago were not true. Please can we have a better look at what you were up to here? And that's just not in the habit of most scientific journalists. It's a very interesting problem, as it were. We need a sort of science critical journalist profession, and we haven't got one.